Back to another session of some very interesting talks. The first of the very interesting talks in this session is from Mihir Bellare, and he'll be talking about concrete security for 2PC.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thanks to organizers for inviting me. So the work I'll tell you about today brings some new directions to secure two-party computation, namely concrete security, and some simple new definitions that enable it. The applications of our framework are to private set intersection and oblivious pseudorandom functions. It's joint work with Rishabh Ranjan, Doreen Rippel, and Ali Aldakiel. So in this setting, secure computation doesn't need an introduction, but to ground the discussion, I'll just pin down some notation. So the inputs of parties 1 and 2 are called x1 and x2. They interact to produce outputs. The functionality here, f, is a function that defines what these outputs should be. On inputs x1, x2, it returns a pair whose first component is the output of party 1, and likewise for party 2. And as an example shown on the table is the private set intersection functionality, which views x1, x2 as sets, gives the first party the intersection, and gives both parties the sizes. We want, as usual, a protocol, which is here called pi, and tells the parties how to send messages. And security for it means that parties don't learn anything about the other party's input other than from the output. This is a magical sounding goal, and as we know, the first wave of research on two-party computation, starting with Yao, was foundational, asking whether this goal could even be achieved and under what assumptions. And this work showed that secure protocols exist for all functionalities. At that time, there wasn't much consideration of efficiency. It was enough that protocols were polynomial time. But that's changing with increasing practical interest in two-party computation, driven by many applications. And thanks in particular to work of many people here, we're getting more and more efficient protocols, not just for generic functionalities, but for particular ones like private set intersection and oblivious pseudorandom functions. Efficiency is shown by actual implementations, for example, over 256-bit curves, and security proofs might now use the random oracle model. However, there's one aspect of the theoretical ethos that this movement towards more efficient protocols preserved, and that was the use of asymptotic security framework, meaning security continues to mean that the advantage of polynomial time adversaries is a negligible function of the security parameter. And I would contend that this is a significant gap with regard to practice for a few reasons that will be expanded on later. But briefly, first, it may not be simple or to even determine how many bits of security the proof gives when the protocol is implemented, say, over a particular 256-bit curve. But perhaps more importantly, distinctions between protocols are invisible. For example, one may have two asymptotically secure protocols, but on a 256-bit curve, one provides 128 bits of security, and the other only 64. And the job of concrete security is to make these kinds of distinctions apparent. It would allow us to more easily determine how much security protocols provide over a particular curve, and also to be able to tell apart protocols that have 128 or 64 bits of security in that case. But even more broadly, moving from asymptotic to concrete security is kind of a natural arc in the evolution of an area as it moves from more theoretical to applied. And this evolution already occurred in many other sub-areas of cryptography, like encryption and signatures. And the suggestion here is that two-party computation has lagged behind a bit in this regard, and now is in a position where there may be some benefit to also at least having this framework in parallel. So with that, I can give you a summary of what we did here. In initiating the study of concrete security for two-party computation, our first contribution is actually definitional. Namely, we give a simple security definition for two-party computation called input indistinguishability, abbreviated INI, and it's indistinguishability-based rather than as traditional in this area being simulation-based. And we argue that this facilitates concrete analyses, but I believe it's actually of interest even in an asymptotic setting, just as an alternative, simpler way to define security. Now, when one poses a new definition, obviously the first concern is it's too weak. But we show that it isn't. We show that input indistinguishably is no weaker than simulation-style definitions in the sense that they're equivalent. Not always, but for some large class of functionalities of practical interest, including PSI invariance. And this mirrors the classical Goldwasser-Micali equivalence of indistinguishability and semantic security for encryption. As I noted earlier, many current proofs of security for two-party computations use the random oracle model, but often it's not explicit in definitions, and that's another gap that our formalization fills, incorporating the random oracle definitionally, and in the process we surface some subtleties about programming of random oracles. We then use these definitions to give concrete security results and bounds for a particular canonical private set intersection protocol that we call the Diffie-Hellman PSI. And we do this in two steps. First, giving a tight proof of Diffie-Hellman PSI based on the security of its underlying OPRF, which is called the 2-hash Diffie-Hellman. And then we give different proofs for the OPRF. And what we showcase here is how changing the assumption changes tightness. We give proofs based on a variety of assumptions with different tightness. Some of these assumptions are familiar. We see a non-tight proof from computational Diffie-Hellman and a tight one from DDH. Other assumptions we may or may not detail later.
Mihir, a question. So the cases where there is not tightness, do you feel like there is actually a security problem? Like if you were to advise practitioners, would you say, do you feel like this reflects an actual issue or a technicality about our ability to prove things?
So I think the latter, because the same protocol can be proved tightly from other assumptions. So
sure, but in the instances where you do not have a tight, do you have better attacks, or maybe it's just about formulating the assumption?
Don't have attacks, no. Yeah, I think that's right. Finally, concrete security opens up a new direction, which is that you can now give new protocols that have the same efficiency as prior ones, but better reductions. So to showcase that, we introduce something called salted Diffie-Hellman PSI, and we again revisit the assumptions and give reductions from them. And briefly, some of them are tighter than was possible for the original protocol. I note that all our work definitions and results are in the semi-honest setting, honest but curious model, and also restricted to deterministic functionalities. Extending this to malicious security and randomized functionalities is worthwhile future work.
Is that true for your definition as well? That
Yes.
equivalence is restricted to semi-honest?
Yes. So that's basically the message, which may be already enough for some of you, and so you can be done. The rest of the talk is simply going to get into all of this in a little more depth. So to start with some background on these two types of security, whenever we do security proofs, it turns out we have a choice between two flavors of provable security, asymptotic and concrete. So how would we make this choice? The first thing to be clear about is that neither of these is always or in general better or worse than the other. It's rather that in particular contexts, one can be more appropriate than the other. For example, the asymptotic setting is the best and most appropriate for classical foundational work. But my argument is that when you're targeting practice, and in particular you want your protocol to be implemented, concrete security is not only superior, but sometimes even necessary. Now, if there is a choice between these frameworks, one can ask how we as authors and researchers make the choice. And one might hope it's by some rational consideration of context and what fits. But the truth is that we make largely a default choice, or actually not make a choice at all, because it's determined mostly by community culture, like where you got your PhD. And due to this, there may be some large gaps in the audience with regard to familiarity with concrete security. So I'll start by expanding a bit on it, with apologies to all the experts in concrete security, and say a little bit what it is and why it might be interesting. There's nothing new or different about this setting. As usual, we're given some scheme or protocol pi, and we want to show that it achieves some security definition, call it T for target, assuming some problem P is hard. Asymptotically, we would have a theorem statement of the familiar form, saying if P is hard, which means polynomial time adversaries against P have negligible advantage, advantage means success probability, then the protocol pi is T secure, meaning probabilistic polynomial time adversaries against it also have negligible advantage. Note that in this setting, adversary advantages are functions of the security parameter, and that's the object to which the formal definition of negligible applies. By the way, I can't resist pausing there for a historical quiz. Does anyone know who introduced the definition of negligible functions? I had to figure this out. No. No one?
Definition or the name?
I think they go together. Where was Oded? Anyway, the proof is by reduction, constructing from a given adversary against the protocol, call it A, an adversary A prime that violates security of the assumption. So nothing novel here. Now, in the concrete setting, there's no formal analog of the theorem. Instead, the theorem that we give explicitly states and claims the reduction and gives an explicit bound in the advantage. Namely, it quantifies the running time and other resources of the adversary as T and Q. These other resources are queries to different oracles. And then it bounds the advantage or success probability of the adversary as a function of the advantage of the constructed adversary, which here we're calling epsilon prime. This function B is the bound, and it can range depending on your proof. And I show here a few examples. A very tight reduction has a bound which is off by just a constant factor, but it could be worse. The advantage here is no longer a function of a security parameter. There may not be a security parameter. It's just a number. And for simplicity here, I've assumed that the running time of the constructed adversary is also about T, so we can just focus on the probability. All right, so you can do things like this, but obvious question is, why would you bother? And there's a bunch of reasons. It starts emerging when you ask about translating your protocol into an actual implementation. So assume we've developed our scheme, and we now want to implement it, say, over a 256-bit curve. And we ask that if, as we know, the discrete log problem is 128 bits of security on that curve, and it's the discrete log problem that's assumed hard in this setting, how many bits of security does our scheme provide? So in the concrete setting, the bounds help you determine that. For example, if the bound was lost a factor of 2, you lose 1 bit of security. If, on the other hand, it lost as much as a square root, you halve the bits of security. But in an asymptotic setting, it's in principle possible to answer this question by looking at the proof. But in practice, that can be quite difficult, especially if the proof cascades into using a whole bunch of other proofs in the literature. Moreover, there is no contradiction to the asymptotic statement of result if there's actually very little, even no security at the 256-bit level, because that's not something that the asymptotics guarantees. Of course, that doesn't mean this happens. It's just that the statement doesn't prevent it. Another, perhaps, angle on this is that we are, of course, highly desirous of having efficient protocols, and we often measure efficiency as a function of the security parameter lambda. So say we have two schemes, pi1 and pi2. One is cubic time in lambda, and the other is quadratic. They are both proven secure under discrete log. They both achieve the same goal. in an asymptotic setting. And we want to know which one we should pick. And that seems obvious. We would pick pi2 because it's substantially faster, right? And the answer is not necessarily, because when we implement this scheme, we need to compare efficiency at the same level of security for both schemes, say 128 bits. And possibly the reductions underlying the two proofs of these schemes have different tightness. And it could be that in order to get 128-bit security, you need a larger group for the second scheme, or in other words, a larger actual concrete value of the security parameter. What that means is when you actually start plugging in numbers, it's the first scheme that ends up being faster. And these types of considerations are hidden in an asymptotic framework, and one of the values of concrete security is to surface these, allow us to see these issues and make the necessary comparisons and choices. Finally, consideration of concrete security opens up a whole fresh landscape of new questions. For example, when you have a protocol, you don't have to stop at merely giving one proof, but you can seek proofs which have better bounds, which has impact on practical efficiency. You can seek new protocols with the same efficiency but tighter reductions. And for a given protocol, you can also explore how different assumptions yield proofs of different tightness. Now, one thing to emphasize here is that concrete security is not at all new. It's widely used historically in symmetric and public key cryptography. It's been used more closely in garbled circuits, sometimes in PIR, in threshold cryptography, and other places. And the only claim to novelty, if any, in this work is to bring that whole perspective into interactive two-party secure computation, reflecting the trend to practical choices there. All right, so that concludes a background. I'll talk a bit about definitions. And indeed, a lot of this work turns out to be definitional. It's our sense that some kinds of definitions are simple and more what we'd call concrete security friendly than other kinds, and so a better choice in our context. So to explain that, I'll start with a taxonomy that divides security definitions into categories, which I'll call single and double quantifier. In the first, the quantification has the usual form. Security means for all adversaries, perhaps with some runtime restriction, the advantage is low. And this is what we're used to. It's the common thing, let's say, for signatures and all indistinguishably-based definitions like IND, CPA, and CCA. And it was the form also assumed in our prior discussion of asymptotic and concrete security. And the second category, there's a simulator. And it adds a quantifier because it must somehow be existentially quantified. And this creates a more complex structure. Now, it's commonly the case that these are called game-based and simulation-based definitions. So there's nothing new there, but I've avoided that terminology because to me, games are a descriptive language. I use games to write simulation-based definitions. And I think quantifier structure better captures the actual distinction. Now, simulation-based definitions obviously have many attractions. They are strong, intuitive, they have composition results, and so forth. But the presence of a simulator complicates concrete security results. That certainly doesn't mean they're impossible. You can do concrete security with simulation, but it's just somewhat harder and less easy to apply in an actual practical setting. And so we had a preference for single quantifier definitions. And so what we asked, however, is can we have the best of both worlds, meaning something that is indistinguishably based, but somehow maintains the nice things about simulation. And luckily there we have an obvious historical paradigm because history says that the answer is yes for encryption. We already have something like that due to the equivalence between indistinguishability and semantic security that was established by Goldwasser-Micali and then further deepened and strengthened by others, including Goldreich. So effectively our question is, could two-party computation see something like this? And our answer is effectively yes. So we give this indistinguishably-based definition called input indistinguishability, and we show it's equivalent to a simulation-based definition. Now the caveat is that it's not equivalent for all functionalities. It's equivalent for a subclass of them, but that class happens to include many things of practical interest, like private set intersections and related functionalities. So I'll give a quick idea of how these definitions flow by starting by reminding you that in the encryption case, indistinguishability asks the adversary to provide two messages, and it gives it back a ciphertext obtained by encrypting one of them, determined by a challenge bit B, under a hidden key, and the adversary has to determine that bit. To avoid trivial attacks, there's a restriction, which is that the lengths of the two messages are the same. So let's try to mirror this for two-party computation and get our INI definition. The role of our messages will be played by a pair of inputs for the honest party. Here, say, for concreteness, the honest party is number 2. And the adversary also provides one input for the dishonest party. What it gets back, playing the role of ciphertext, is a conversation transcript, or effectively the view to which it's entitled, which means its output and coins. And those come from an honest execution of the protocol on the one input of the dishonest party and a challenge input for the honest one. Again here, to exclude trivial wins, we need a condition, which is that the output of the functionality to the dishonest party must be the same. But once we come to fill in all that, we do arrive at a definition. So we may not need too much detail, but I drew out the game here. There's an adversary, and there's a challenge bit, and it has access to an oracle called run, which when you start it up will execute the protocol honestly and give the adversary the stuff that it needs. And to win, it guesses the challenge bit, and it has some advantage, which is the weighted probability of winning. So I won't bother detail that too much. In its raw form, the problem is we haven't excluded these trivial attacks, which arise due to different values of the functionality for the dishonest party, but we can do that by just adding a condition. So in our paper, we also give a simulation-based definition, in fact, two of them, one for a programmable random oracle model, the other for non-programmable, and they're specified by games, and they also give rise to advantage functions, but now these advantage functions also depend on a simulator that shows up in the subscript. I'd rather spend a few seconds on a more subtle point, which is that we think of simulation as allowing, let's say in the programmable case, that the simulator programs the random oracle. But random oracle queries can arise not just from the adversary and protocol, but from the functionality, as happens with 2-hash Diffie-Hellman. And we found a bit of a subtlety in that regard, which is that you can't answer those queries via the simulator. And that would give rise to obviously incorrect protocols having proofs. So instead, we use a kind of different definitional approach. Some remarks on the definitions is that we allow multiple queries to this run oracle to capture multiple executions of the protocol. The purpose of this is to study composition, which is classical in secure computation, from a quantitative perspective. We want to know, if you repeat a protocol many times, what is the quantitative change in security, which we can now measure. We then give relations between these definitions, and the most important one is that one might be skeptical of input indistinguishably out of the fear that it's weaker than simulations. But what we show first is that simulation is stronger. The non-programmable version implies the programmable, which in turn implies input indistinguishability. And it is the case that input indistinguishability and sim are not in general equivalent. But the interesting bolded arrow is that there's a class of functionalities satisfying a condition we define called invertibility, in which input indistinguishability does imply even the stronger version of simulation. So in that case, you have kind of what I call the best of two worlds.
Question, I mean, in saying Canetti's standard, the papers people always refer to in the context of sequential composition, there is, for example, an example of applying a one-way permutation to the XOR of two inputs, which shows why simulation and indistinguishability are not the same. So, do your examples provide something beyond that? My point is that we already knew such examples of separations.
Yeah, in this case, the example is kind of trivial. All it does is it says that you kind of give a one-way function of one party's input so that the choice is fixed by something else. And so input indistinguishability is trivial, but it's not simulation secure.
Right.
Or maybe it's the same.
There it was a bit different, but I'm not sure why. There it was really a one-way permutation on the XOR of two inputs. Maybe the setting was...
Yeah, maybe that works too.
Maybe you already mentioned this definition looks similar to the one by Mihir, the input indistinguishable computation.
This is just for semi-honest, right? Mikali was targeting malicious security.
Okay, so then to recap, we give this definition of invertibility. This applies to functionalities, not protocols. It's a property of the functionality which, if present, allows input indistinguishably to imply simulation. And we don't have to go through it in detail, but roughly what it says is that if you have the output of the functionality and your own input, then you can sample an input for the other party which explains the output you have. You can invert that output. We can then test and see that for functionalities like private set intersection, it's very easy to establish that they do have this property. And the same holds for variants of private set intersection. And so the conclusion is that for some set of functionalities of practical interest, the simple single quantifier, concrete security-friendly input indistinguishability definition is actually equivalent to standard simulation. And so we can kind of safely use the INI version. Yeah?
This inverting process, are there any distributional requirements or any value?
Any value is okay. Yeah. Okay, well, I'm a bit low on time. So very quickly, the next part of our work considers the classical Diffie-Hellman PSI protocol based on OPRFs as given by Haze and Linder. And we give proofs for it based on a slew of different assumptions, all discrete log based. And in all of these, we look at different adversary resources, queries to different oracles and running time, and we bound the advantage of the DH PSI adversary as a function of an advantage of constructed adversaries. And here you can just sort of look at different bounds, see, for example, that under computational Diffie-Hellman, you lose quadratic factors in the number of the random oracle, but then when you get to decision Diffie-Hellman, you actually have up to a constant tight results. We then give this salted Diffie-Hellman PSI protocol where we kind of randomize before we apply hashing. And the bottom line there is that when we revisit all the proofs and you start seeing improvements. For example, for computational Diffie-Hellman, the quadratic factor dropped to linear, and for other assumptions which I haven't detailed but are in the paper, you also see some drops. So this is just the boundary of this area. There's a lot of ground that can be covered here. There are lots of existing protocols still needing concrete proofs. We have the possibility of giving new protocols with tighter proofs, doing malicious security, looking at more composition result tightness, and so forth. So I'd rather use the few more minutes to say a couple of broader things. And the first is about this gap between the asymptotic and concrete setting, which is not merely a technical one, but rather a cultural one, as a gap between two communities. And Perhaps some of this discussion gave the impression that we have two communities kind of at war at each other and arguing or something. That's not at all true. The truth is that they just ignore each other. And each has their own way of doing things, and they're comfortable in their own space. And this is a product of, effectively, the past. So part of the hope of this talk is to change this, where at least we may come to a point where we recognize the existence of the other person, but even better, we actually get along, because I think there's a lot we can learn and benefit from the other side in terms of collaborations and problems and opportunities. And the second item is even broader. It's clear that doing good theory is central to the heart of this cryptographic community, but more and more we see efforts by many people to impact practice by creating cryptography that actually gets deployed and used in products. And this has been very successful. Cryptography has blossomed into use everywhere. But somehow this usage by itself is an uncertain metric of the value of what one does, because there's another question we could ask, namely, for what are our creations used and who benefits from them? For not all uses are the same in terms of societal value. It's a general fact, but we could look, for example, at PSI. What are its applications? Well, there's something like the Callisto tool for privacy-preserving reporting of sexual assault. Obviously, it's hard not to like an application like that. There's also Have I Been Pawned for testing credential breaches. Great. But those are low volume. The much greater volume in applications are things like privacy of ad conversion, where Google has some list of people who saw an ad, and one of their advertisers aims to determine the intersection of that with people who visited the site for a purchase. And here, privacy is not for you and me. It's for the corporations and their financial benefits. So cryptography here ends up ultimately in the service of what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, which is a term for how the internet economy works and the way our attention and data is used by corporations to predict and influence our behavior. There are many studies that show many deleterious effects of that in this economy in which the product is us and our attentions. So corporations have done well under this, but the societal risks are more nebulous. So I think it would be great if in a venue like this we could have conversations about things like this. We benefit here particularly from the presence of people who actually work at these companies. They would know a lot more than me, and they may even have some leverage. Because in the end, as the other Yuval Harari historian pointed out, as a species we seem to have come up kind of short on wisdom, despite all our wonderful intellectual achievements. And we pursue self-destructive behavior historically. And I wonder if there's anything we can do to shift the balance, shift the needle a little, at least in whatever domains we work on. So that's it.
Take a question maybe while the next speaker gets set up.